My name is David Gilbertson. I was born October 29th, 1949 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Both of my parents were raised during the Depression. That had a great influence on them. My father watched the farm he grew up on be foreclosed on. He later was the first in his family to go past the 8th grade. He actually graduated from college. World War II was declared and he had to make a decision. He had already been accepted into the seminary, which was an automatic deferment from being drafted, or he could go into the Army. And he decided to go into the Army and forego the seminary until after his service in the Army. My father was raised in southern Wisconsin, a little town called Sisseton, and he was an only child. My mother was raised in Kindred, North Dakota, one of 8 children. Both her parents came from Norway. In fact, they were not citizens when she was born. The family was pretty much bilingual as she was being raised. In fact, when she was in 1st grade, she was appointed class translator because the teacher could not speak Norwegian, and she was the only one of the 1st graders that could speak both Norwegian and English. And of course, the kids are pretty adept at learning the English as the year went on. She, after graduating from nursing school in Fargo, North Dakota in 1941, enlisted in the Army Nurses Corps for 6 months. In December, war was declared and everybody was in for the duration. Because she was a surgical nurse, she was immediately sent to the South Pacific and worked in surgery. And in those days, it was right behind the front lines. Nothing like you see in the TV show MASH, where they would helicopter out the wounded. You lived or you died right there. So it was not patch 'em up surgery, it was life or death surgery. And because there was such a shortage of surgical nurses, she was not rotated, and she did not get home till 1946. And most of the time was spent in combat conditions. And she's lucky she survived, and this, so am I. My father was in 8th grade when his father was foreclosed upon. That so affected my dad that he never borrowed a dime in his life, ever. If he could not pay cash, he didn't buy it. And my mother was pretty much of the same vein, that they both struggled through a depression, and that, along with their World War II experiences, were what really, controlled their personalities, and their religious faith too. They're all kind of intertwined. But growing up, pretty much everybody's dad had been in World War II of my age, so it was not unique. My mother was unique because she had been in combat. In fact, when we were in Sisseton, as a joke, they tried to sign her up for the Veterans of Foreign Wars, which she qualified for. They would take women who had actually been overseas, and there weren't very many. But then they thought, since she qualified for the Veterans of Foreign Wars, they were going to sign my dad up for the auxiliary, since he had been in California during the war. I'm 100% Norwegian. His family, though, came over earlier, to where his grandfather was in the Union Army in the Civil War. But both my parents were fluent in Norwegian, to where when I was growing up, if they wanted to discuss something at the dinner table and didn't want us kids to know what they were talking about, they simply slipped into talking Norwegian. We didn't have a clue. I graduated from law school, bachelor, and I come from, as I say, a family of socially slow Norwegians. My grandfather was 30 when he was married. My father was 30 when he was married. And I was basically 30 when I got married. I married a young lady named Deborah Johnson, who I had met in Sisseton, and we are still married today, and we have 4 children: Kristen, Eric, Rachel, and John. And John just graduated from South Dakota State in engineering about a week and a half ago. So for the first time since 1985, I have no children in school. When I was 1 year old, my father was a minister, moved from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Sisseton, South Dakota, which is an area that has a significant Indian population. At one time it was a reservation, parts of it still are. They have a tribal government. And so I grew up in a multicultural area. I had two younger sisters. My one sister, Mary, was born in 1953 and was living in Philadelphia. She has both a PhD in philosophy and a JD. She works part-time as an attorney, and she works part-time at a college teaching philosophy. My youngest sister, Margaret, was born in 1954 and sadly died in a car accident at age 17, just before she graduated from high school. Growing up as a minister's son, and a good chunk of the town were Lutherans, and my dad was a Lutheran minister, was that you were told to behave or else. And so it was probably good training for becoming a judge later in life to be raised as a minister's son. I can't say that I was an angel, probably far from it, but you learned a little bit earlier about what a monastic life is like. Started in the Sisseton school system and till 9th grade, and then my father moved us to Brookings, South Dakota. I went to high school and college there, graduated from college in 1972. By then I had already decided I wanted to be a lawyer, so looked around, and the best bargain at the time cost-wise was the University of South Dakota, so I went down there. Spent 3 years there in law school and graduated in 1975 with a Juris Doctorate. I worked at a grocery store both in high school and college, Red Out, which is no longer, they went bankrupt. And at the time, I was introduced to the corporate structure of doing business. To put it bluntly, I hated it. And I concluded that the only way I would be happy in life is to work for myself. And I could come up with 3 ways to do that. I could be a doctor, I could be a minister, or I could be a lawyer. Well, I wasn't that good in science, and I didn't like the sight of blood, so there went the doctor option. Minister, my dad had been one, and I saw the stresses of that kind of a job, working weekends, 7 days a week, so I didn't really think that that was for me. So kind of by default, there's the third option, be a lawyer. And I liked government, I liked history, so it seemed like kind of a natural fit. I knew early on, probably in high school, that I wanted to be a lawyer. So by the time I got to South Dakota State, one of the reasons I went there was cost. It was in-state tuition. And in fact, we used to pay our tuition in cash. I'd go cash my paycheck at Red Owl, go up and pay my tuition, which is about $170 a semester in cash. And so I was working 35 hours a week at the Red Owl, and I started out with a history major, and then I wandered also into political science, and finally, through a fluke, into geography, but I never dropped any of them. So when I graduated, they did a check, and I was the first person in the history of South Dakota State University to graduate with 3 majors in 4 years, plus working 35 hours a week at a grocery store. So I really didn't participate in extracurricular activities. There really wasn't any time. My first 3 years I was no scholar. In fact, my folks actually had me repeat kindergarten, thus making me probably the only Chief Justice in the country to have flown kindergarten. By the end of 3rd grade, I wasn't doing very well, and in 4th grade, I had a teacher named Mrs. Gladys Johnson, who had every 4th grader in the Sisseton school system, 48 kids in one class, and she ruled with an iron hand. And she assured me by the time I got out of 4th grade, I would be able to read as good as anybody. And it was not a fun experience, but she got the job done. By the time I got out of 4th grade, I loved to read. And that was probably the defining moment in my education from start to finish. In 7th grade, I had an English teacher named Helen Westby who taught me how to write. And obviously very essential for a person in my job too. But when I got to college, there were a number of excellent professors at South Dakota State. J.P. Hendrickson, the head of the political science department, and Bob Burns. Bob Burns taught constitutional law, and he taught it in the Socratic method, so that it was kind of your introduction into law school. In fact, when I did go to law school and compared the course there for constitutional law against Professor Burns at South Dakota State, Burns's was tougher. And he also did examination by essay, so that introduced me to that. Dr. Edward Hogan was the head of the geography department, and very strong influence in my life also. Those are the ones that really stand out. I don't particularly look back on it in fond memories. I think it's the same as talking to anybody who served in the military and gone through boot camp. At the end of the 3 years, you have friends for life because you've all gone through the same thing. But in those days, it was still kind of the teaching that you would see in the movie The Paper Chase. They taught by fear. And what they were trying to do was to teach you to think on your own, think under pressure. There was a valid reason for it. And looking back on it, I owe that a lot. But would I want to repeat it? No. So the first year was terrifying. I was sure I was going to flunk out. Actually, I was writing to other colleges that had graduate schools in history, thinking I might be better suited to be a history professor. But somehow I made it through the first couple of years, and then worked on the law review my third year, and there were only 5 of us. So actually, I spent more time my third year in law school working on the law review than I probably did in class. South Dakota State was, probably half the size it is now, and once you got past the freshman level courses, they were fairly small. The teachers were excellent. They were approachable. I don't think I ever had a graduate assistant teach me in 4 years. They were all professors, all had PhDs as far as I know. Law school, the number one thing we had there was a student-teacher ratio. The largest classes we had 30 people in them. My sister went to Villanova, they had 200. So you got to know the professors one-on-one. The graduate level classes would probably be 8 to 10 people. And so you really got to know the subject matter and the professors. And I think that's always been the strong point of the University of South Dakota Law School, is that student-teacher ratio. It also probably taught me that I wanted to stay in South Dakota, which is huge because a lot of my fellow law students did not. And I determined I wanted to be a trial lawyer through some contacts there. And so I left law school with a pretty good idea of what I wanted to do. And fortunately, because I'd worked my way through college and I had some part-time jobs in law school, which was also very cheap in those days, I graduated debt-free, and I wasn't married. So I had $200 in my pocket, but I had no debt, no student debt after 7 years. So I looked at going back to Sisseton, where I'd been raised, because the jurisdiction there had just changed from federal to state, back by a decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. And there was like 25 or 30 felony cases that had gone through federal court that now had to be retried in state court. And it was a very enticing opportunity to get trial experience very quickly. And the state's attorney up there, I'd known since we were both in grade school. He was 2 years older than I was, and he says, "I'm overwhelmed. If you're interested, come on and help me be a prosecutor." So I did, and 6 months later, I was the lead counsel in a murder trial. Something that I think was fairly unique as far as getting that kind of trial experience. And that, I think, was one of the key factors in my life, and probably becoming a judge, was getting so much time in the courtroom so quickly.